Hey everybody, this is chapter 2, chapter 1, God, I am a monster, Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. The last thing I read was the introduction. This chapter is titled, chapter 1 is titled, Origins. Origins. At the time of Friedrich Pollock's birth, on the 22nd of May, 1894, Freiburg, Breisgau, was a medium-sized provincial city in the southwest German region of Baden, with a university and a population of 50,000. It was large enough for city life, entrepreneurial know-how, and scientific innovation to flourish, yet small enough to allow its traditional social structures to withstand radical political and economic change. The Albert Ludwigs University, established in 1457, was one of Germany's oldest and most prestigious institutions of higher education. And its 2,000 students, women were first admitted in 1899, maintain a palpable presence in the city. Predominantly liberal and bourgeois in character, Freiburg reaped considerable benefits from the annexation of Alsace following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, especially thanks to the newly constructed rail line in Colmar. The city's increased prosperity was also reflected in its architecture and infrastructure. A horse-drawn bus service was introduced in 1891, an electric tram service a decade later. A significant number of new properties inspired by historicist concepts transformed the cityscape. Given the rapid increase in the city's prosperity and cultural significance, the population, boosted notably by wealthy citizens from the Ruhr region and from Hamburg, many of the latter fleeing from the cholera epidemic of 1892, grew to more than 80,000 on the eve of the First World War. At the time of Friedrich Pollock's birth, the city's small Jewish congregation had roughly 1,000 members. As we'll see, Jews not only began to settle in Freiburg again in earnest in the 1860s. Jews only began to settle in Freiburg again in earnest in the 1860s. The city's budding Jewish congregation was initially taken care of by the neighboring district rabbinate based in Salzburg. While its congregations were beacons of rural Jewish traditionalism, Freiburg's Jews tended to be more reform-oriented. In 1885, a new district rabbinate was established in Freiburg. It subsumed the former district rabbinate of Breisgau, and in 1887, following the death of district rabbi Mendel (Emmanuel) Dreyfus, the year before, the district rabbinate of Salzburg too. None too surprisingly, the traditionalists were not best pleased, as the Orthodox journal Der Israelit (the Israelite) lamented, quote, "The Freiburg congregation is strictly impious. An organ plays both on Shabbat and the holidays. Hence, right-minded and genuinely observant rabbis were prevented from applying for the new district rabbi position, in accordance with the old saying that a congregation gets the rabbi it deserves. Freiburg, too, now has a rabbi who, in terms of his, quote, persuasion, end quote, is a perfect fit. We are sufficiently tolerant not to begrudge Freiburg's Jews their rabbi. All we want is not to have him imposed on us," end quote. The insufficiently pious rabbi in question, Freiburg's first rabbi in the modern era, was Adolf Leuven. Adolf Levin, fuck. According to Wikipedia, Adolf Levin was a German rabbi and author. Adolf Levin was born in Peine, Grand Duchy of Posen, on the 23rd of September, 1843. Levin was educated at the Jewish Theological Seminary and at the University of Breisgau. In 1872, Adolf Levin was appointed rabbi in Kotzman, later in Koblenz, and in 1885 was called to the rabbinate of Freiburg im Breisgau. Adolf Levin died in 1910. Back to the text. Originally from Posen, Poznan, then part of Germany, Levin was a graduate of the renowned Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, now Wroclaw, who, before assuming his position in Freiburg, had gathered plenty of experience as a rabbi, first in Kashmin, now Kazmin, then in Koblenz. During Levin's 24-year tenure in Freiburg, Levin exerted a profound influence on the congregation and the way services were celebrated in Freiburg's first synagogue of the modern era, inaugurated in 1870. Among the new rules Levin enforced was a dress code predicated on bourgeois standards of respectability. Quote, "Those who attend the synagogue are expected to turn up in suitable, preferably dark clothing, ... On Saturdays and the holidays, married members of the congregation must wear a black top hat. Adults should wear dark hats." End quote. Levin. By contrast, the use of prayer shawls and loud praying by individuals were prohibited. Levin's liberal Judaism was fused to an ostentatious German patriotism, which Levin articulated with great self-confidence, especially in disputes with anti-Semites who accused Jews of insufficient loyalty to the fatherland. Levin shared this stance with many members of his flock. Bourgeois in outlook, many were selective in their religious observance, and some abandoned religious practice altogether. This by no means automatically implied that they officially left the congregation. However, Judaism no longer exerted any great influence on their daily lives, but they still vigorously defend themselves against attacks on their Jewishness. Friedrich Pollock's parents seem to have belonged to this group. A photo from 1902 shows his family in an almost classic bourgeois pose. Julius Pollock, who lived from 1866 to 1937, as the paterfamilias, sports a Kaiser Bill mustache and is by far the tallest figure in the picture. He stands at the center of the family, his gaze directed outward toward society. Elizabeth, quote, Elsa, end quote, Pollock, 1867 to 1930, end parenthesis, the mother, wearing a high-necked dress, looks sideways at Hans Pollock, parenthesis, 1895 to 1973, end parenthesis, the younger son. Both Hans and Friedrich Pollock are wearing sailor suits. Given widespread enthusiasm for the Imperial Navy, they are all the rage at the time. Yet Friedrich stands slightly apart on the right-hand side, almost as though he had already taken his first steps towards the independence he later asserted. That said, Friedrich is holding on to his mother's arm even as she looks the other way. Family portraits of this kind were typical for the middle classes, and they were, of course, largely staged by the photographers. They tended to be exhibited in prominent position in the drawing room to display the merits of the bourgeois nuclear family that emerged as the social norm in Imperial Germany. In this respect, Jewish and Christian families hardly differed. There is nothing in the Pollock family photo to suggest that they were Jewish. Evidently, their Jewishness was not integral to the way in which they wished to present themselves to the world. Friedrich Pollock remained close to his mother until her early death. She came from Cologne, where her birth family, the Franks, were well established. Her parents, quote, still attended synagogue on the holidays, end quote. Pollock later recalled, quote, but they were already liberal Jews, and my mother confirmed that she never went. She no more attended synagogue than I did, end quote. We know nothing about Julius Pollock's religious orientation. Julius Pollock's son later described Julius as a, quote, anti-Semite, end quote, who, quote, did not really want to socialize with Jews, end quote. It would seem, however, that his animosity was principally reserved for Jews who did not conform to his bourgeois standards, such as the more traditional Jews from Salzburg, in contrast to his brother Isidor Louis, later Hans Ludwig, and Pollock. Julius Pollock never formally left the congregation and was buried in the Jewish section of the Prague Cemetery in Stuttgart. Friedrich Pollock's paternal grandfather, Salomon Pollock, 1834 to 1899, originally came from the small locality of Rust, located 30 kilometers northwest of Freiburg, where a Jewish community had existed since the 17th century. In the mid-19th century, Rust Jews, who made up roughly 1/10 of the overall population, fell in hard times and increasingly migrated to urban locations. The Code Napoleon, the civil code enacted in Baden in 1810, allowed Jews to settle legally in Freiburg again for the first time in more than 400 years. As the economic circumstances of the Jews in the surrounding rural localities deteriorated, the number of Jews in Freiburg very gradually increased. Yet even by the middle of the century, given the remaining legal restrictions, a mere 20 Jews lived in Freiburg. Only once Jews were granted more or less full freedom of trade and settlement in 1862 did the Jewish community begin to grow in earnest. Only once Jews were granted more or less full freedom of trade and settlement in 1862 did the Jewish community begin to grow in earnest. The decisive change also paved the way for Solomon and Pauline Pollock's (1839 to 1912) moved to Freiburg. On the 18th of October 1862, within a fortnight of the, quote, Gesetz über die bürgerliche Gleichstellung der Israeliten als Gemeindebürger im Großherzogtum Baden, end quote, law regarding the civil normalization of Israelites in the Grand Duchy of Baden, end receiving Grand Ducal assent, and only 3 days after its coming into force, their men's apparel store offering, quote, German, French, and English fashion, end opened its doors on Schustergasse. Announcing the opening in the Freiburger Zeitung, Salomon Pollock expressly pointed to his, quote, varied experience in all branches of this business, end quote. Following his formal recognition as a citizen of Freiburg in 1864, he not only announced that, quote, by popular demand alongside my men's apparel business, the most refined and modern women's coats and jackets, end quote, would henceforth be offered. Salomon Pollock also acquired a residential property, Eisenstrasse 6, in central Freiburg, a stone's throw from the Minster, with its infamous denunciatory juxtaposition of synagoga and ecclesia, and just 2 blocks from the first prayer house run by the New Israelite Religious Society, established in 1864. At the time, 35 Jewish families lived in Freiburg, and the Pollocks were among the congregation's founding members. Yet their ties to the congregation soon loosened, and they became increasingly lax in their attendance of services. Above all, they ran a business and wanted to participate in the city's bourgeois life. Salomon Pollock became a, quote, fastnet, end quote, the local carnival, end enthusiast, and actively supported the Carnival Association, one of the, quote, well-respected, positively upper-middle-class associations, end quote, among whose members, quote, factory owners and entrepreneurs, solicitors, and architects featured prominently. In 1873, Salomon Pollock added a shoe and boot emporium to his apparel store. It was located close to the family home on Eisenstrasse 1-2, but does not seem to have been a success. In 1880, Solomon Pollock stopped selling shoes and turned all his attention to the apparel business again, which was now located on the ground floor of the family home. When Solomon Pollock retired in 1887, his sons Emmanuel (later Emile, 1864 to 1920), and Julius Pollock took over the running of the business, reorienting it exclusively in women's apparel. That it took 2 years following Solomon Pollock's death for his estate to be settled definitively suggests that there may have been some wrangling between the two elder brothers as to who should inherit the Damenkonfektionsgeschäft, S. Pollock, ladies' apparel store S. Pollock, as it now was. In the end, Julius Pollock took over the enterprise. In 1902, Emmanuel Pollock, who was presumably paid out, moved to Dresden to join his new wife. Yet the family business in Freiburg evidently did not exhaust Julius Pollock's ambitions. In 1900, with considerable financial support from his parents, Pollock joined forces with his brother-in-law, Zygmunt Nördlinger, 1868 to 1942, Julius Pollock was married to Zygmunt Nördlinger was married to Julius Pollock's sister, Rosalia, who lived from 1871 to 1942, to establish a substantial leather and travel goods factory. Nördlinger and Pollock in Stuttgart, located 130 kilometers northeast of Freiburg as the crow flies, and 200 kilometers by road, According to Werner Zombart, in Germany, the leather industry, quote, was already more developed in the mid-19th century than any other branch of industry at that time. At that time, end quote. Yet by the turn of the century, competition between the German leather producers, of whom there were 551 in 1846, had led to a marked decline in their numbers. Hence the need for Julius Pollock to find a partner if he wanted to become a serious player in the industry. In this sense, the creation of Nördlinger and Pollock was, in itself, a reflection of the extraordinary intensification in capitalist competition following the Great Depression of 1873 to 1896. Friedrich Pollock's father was now involved in running two prosperous businesses. In Freiburg, his decision to focus exclusively on women's apparel paid off, and in 1905 the business was awarded the title, quote, by appointment of the Archduke of Baden, end quote. Nördlinger and Pollock, too, was a considerable success, but Pollock and his family continued to live in the apartment above the shop in Freiburg for another decade. Consequently, he was forced to commute, which was no mean feat, given that cars were still an extraordinary luxury at the time. Whenever possible, he took the train in Stuttgart, but Freiburg remained his main home. Only in 1910 did Julius Pollock finally decide to move the family to Stuttgart to be closer to the factory. The following year, Julius Pollock took Adela Rudenberg, a former employee, on board as his partner in the apparel store, allowing him to concentrate fully on the leather goods business. Pollock eventually sold his remaining share in the apparel business to Rudenberg in 1914, when Nördlinger and Pollock shifted its focus to goods needed by the military and massively expanded its production capacity. For all the sense the partnership with Zygmunt Nördlinger made in economic terms, it also altered Julius Pollock's role. In Freiburg, Julius Pollock's father, Solomon, and then he himself had borne sole responsibility for all their, sometimes controversial, business decisions. In Stuttgart, he was accountable to his partner. Not that this in any way diminishes his status as pater familias and the dominant spouse in the marriage. In return for the prospect of a promising future running the family business, Julius Pollock expected submission, diligence, and obedience from his sons Friedrich and Hans. Daily life in the family home was shaped not so much by love, warmth, and good humor, but primarily by a, quote, puritanical mindset, end quote, concerned exclusively with hard work and the acquisition of wealth. Even after they moved to Stuttgart, with its 300,000 inhabitants and lively cultural scene, the parents showed little interest in or respect for intellectual pursuits. They are relatively plain people, and despite being middle class and well off, owned none of the sophistication and classical education of the urban bourgeoisie. In 1961, Elisa Nagella Nördlinger, the daughter of another (unrelated) Jewish businessman in Stuttgart, recalled a very different experience. Quote, although my father's health gave them a good deal of cause for concern, my parents were very open-minded and sought to give us children access to all the cultural opportunities Stuttgart had to offer. So we had a great childhood, as well as the Neue Tageblatt. One read the Beobachter and the Frankfurter Zeitung, went to the theater and held a subscription for the symphony concerts, and regularly went to the Fine Arts Society and the Association for Commercial Geography, end quote. If the Pollocks occasionally attended such events, they did so principally out of a sense of social obligation. The Pollocks were more enthusiastic about joint rambling excursions with other families in the Swabian Jura and the Rems Valley. Their enthusiasm for nature was part and parcel of their local patriotism, which coexisted quite harmoniously with their sense of Jewishness. While Alice's father considered himself, quote, not a Swabian Jew, but a Jewish Swabian, end quote, and maintained his affiliation with the Israelite Religious Society as a matter of course, Julius Pollock kept his distance from the life of the congregation, while Alice's father, who lived just 2 minutes from the Pollocks, remained partially observant, attended synagogue on the holidays, and served the congregation in a number of voluntary roles. Julius Pollock had abandoned Judaism altogether. Friedrich Pollock's father was an entrepreneur first, and then a German, and a husband and a father. Friedrich Pollock's father, Julius, did not deny his Jewish background, but neither did it shape Julius's sense of self. And yet, Julius's immediate social circle, both professional and private, was almost exclusively Jewish. Not overly concerned with issues beyond his own business interests, he was a conservative by inclination and despised the liberal haute bourgeoisie with its aesthetic leanings. For Julius Pollock, the fine arts, religion, and philosophy, even medicine, as Friedrich Pollock later recalled, were pointless indulgences. Quote, I know from my own family that all professors who were not scientists, medics included, were met with contempt. It was proper businessmen who actually achieve something while they work ... the others read, end quote. Friedrich Pollock. This attitude may have been reinforced by the competitive edge of Julius Pollock's relationship with his much younger brother, Isidor Louis, (1873 to 1939), who decided not to go into business and instead trained as a urologist. Following the completion of his medical doctorate in 1898, Isidor Louis called himself Hans Ludwig Pollock. Fully integrated into Freiburg society, Hans Ludwig Pollock, unlike his brother, officially left the Jewish congregation. In Julius Pollock's eyes, this meant that his brother had chosen the path of least resistance. He himself might have turned his back on Judaism, but would not have dreamt of abandoning the Jewish congregation. For him, this was simply a matter of self-respect. In the previous generation, it had been the youngest brother who chose a different path. This time it was the older son who, quote, stayed, end quote, and it fell to Pollock's younger brother Hans, born on the 9th of September 1895, to become an entrepreneur and took over their father's business. The brothers do not seem to have been particularly close, and Friedrich tended to look down on his little brother who, as he saw it, lacked the courage to make his own decisions. Like his father, Hans married the daughter of a Jewish businessman, Ida Stern, née Joseph, 1892 to 1982, a war widow whose first husband, Emil Stern, was killed in 1916. In 1922, Hans adopted her daughter from her first marriage, Lieselotte, Lilo, born in 1913, When life in Nazi Germany became intolerable, the family fled first in 1936 to Amsterdam, then to Buenos Aires, where Hans Hispanicized his first name, changed it to Juan. Friedrich and Hans Pollock's mother died in 1930, their father in 1937, and contact between the brothers remained minimal during the war. Only at an advanced age did Friedrich Pollock develop a more pronounced sense of family. Yet, for now, all this lay in the distant future. The process by which Friedrich Pollock distanced himself from his family and its values was gradual. From an early age, his parents sought to prepare him for his prospective role in the family business. Pollock attended the humanistic secondary school in Freiburg, graduating with a qualification that made him eligible for the so-called voluntary one-year form of military service. Friedrich did not shine at school, and it is little wonder that the higher secondary school in Stuttgart refused to admit him when the family moved there. Since it was never envisaged that Friedrich Pollock, would go to university, his parents saw no need for him to qualify for university admission. His parents assumed it was much more important for him to gain practical experience both in his father's firm and with entrepreneurs abroad with whom his father was in business. The sons of prosperous entrepreneurs and merchants were frequently trained in this way, daughters were rarely given the same opportunity, thus acquiring their management skills on the job. Internships abroad allowed them to hone their language skills and network with international partners. If they were really lucky, they might even find a suitable future wife while abroad. Friedrich Pollock's existence was comprehensively foreordained then. Friedrich Pollock would be a successful entrepreneur, marry, have 1 or 2 children, and be a loyal citizen serving his fatherland. That his life took an entirely different turn resulted not least from a very special, lifelong friendship that, far from his youth to his death, shaped his existence even in its most intricate details, the friendship with Max Horkheimer. It's the end of chapter 1. Thank you for listening.